The events of September 11, 2001, represent one of the most significant critical junctures in modern history. The attacks did not merely result in tragedy, they immediately facilitated the construction of the War on Terror framework, fundamentally shifting American foreign policy, domestic security architecture, and cultural landscape for a generation. To understand the alternative path, a world without the subsequent invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and without the comprehensive domestic security state, one must first meticulously define the strategic environment and policy priorities of the United States on September 10, 2001. If you're enjoying what we're creating, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing. It helps us out more than you can possibly imagine. The George W. Bush administration entered office in 2001 with a foreign policy agenda distinctly different from the subsequent counterterrorism doctrine. The priorities centered on managing great power relationships and redefining America's military footprint, rather than engaging in perpetual conflict in the Middle East. Prior to the attacks, the dominant strategic concern in Washington was the rise of the People's Republic of China, PRC. The Bush team viewed China as the foremost strategic competitor to the United States. This posture mandated policy discussions focused on issues like missile defense and regional stability. In contrast, conflicts and threats emanating from the Middle East, such as Iraq and North Korea, were believed manageable through strategies of containment, as articulated by then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. The administration was deeply critical of the William J. Clinton era's perceived overextension and nation-building efforts, signaling an intent to husband resources and focus on core alliances in Europe and East Asia. This meant that, absent an existential shock, the administration was structurally inclined to limit foreign deployments and avoid large, complex stability operations. For instance, discussions regarding regional stability involved complex, technical negotiations aimed at preventing the escalation of missile capabilities across the Taiwan Strait. Analysts suggested seeking verifiable agreements wherein China would limit its missile threat to Taiwan in exchange for Taiwan forgoing additions to its modest anti-missile capability. This highlights a strategic focus on diplomatic management of great power rivalries, rather than a readiness for immediate military intervention and regime change. While the U.S. was not oblivious to the threat of transnational terrorism, the response paradigm was defined by law enforcement and incremental military force protection, rather than a whole-of-government mobilization attacks such as the Khobar Towers bombing in 1996 and the USS Cole bombing in 2000 demonstrated al-Qaeda's lethal capability and its focus on U.S. military assets abroad. These precursor attacks led to security improvements within the Department of Defense, DoD, specifically concerning deterrence, disruption, and mitigation of attacks on installations and in-transit forces. However, the institutional learning was isolated. For instance, the investigation into the USS Cole attack concluded that the commanding officer lacked the specific intelligence, focused training, or appropriate equipment to effectively prevent the determined assault, leading to recommended changes in Navy procedures. The institutional response was often reactive and internal, focused on fixing military security flaws, not on restructuring the entire apparatus of domestic intelligence and security. Throughout the 1990s, U.S. counterterrorism policy had been evolving away from a purely law enforcement approach toward a national security mindset, utilizing multilateral efforts, sanctions, and limited militarized operations against terror. However, this trajectory lacked the necessary political and ideological mandate to execute widespread military invasions or radical domestic changes. The eventual policy framework adopted after 9/11 resonated profoundly with the American public because it was overlaid onto deep-seated notions of American exceptionalism, which posits the U.S. as a force for good against evil with a unique mission. The attacks provided the critical trauma necessary to transform a complex countercrime policy into a simple, maximalist crusade. The legislative framework governing intelligence gathering and domestic surveillance before 9/11 was defined primarily by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, of 1978, which sought to regulate electronic surveillance for foreign intelligence purposes against American citizens or residents within the U.S. While some figures within the administration, such as Vice President Dick Cheney, were already prominent proponents of expanded U.S. spy powers, these aspirations remained checked by existing civil liberties protections and legal debates. The protection of the human right to privacy, codified in instruments like Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, served as a crucial legal barrier against the kind of mass, ubiquitous data collection that would later characterize the post-9/11 era. Without the national crisis of 9/11, any attempt to grant the government sweeping surveillance powers, comparable to the later USA Patriot Act, would have faced significant domestic legislative and judicial resistance, preventing the overnight revision of surveillance laws that occurred later. The historical reality hinges upon the sudden and traumatic violation of U.S. sovereign territory on September 11, 2001, an event that instantly provided the political authority necessary to implement policies previously deemed too expansive or controversial. The attacks that targeted the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington were unprecedented in U.S. history. Unlike Pearl Harbor, which was a military target, the assaults killed nearly 3,000 civilians at the heart of great cities during a peaceful morning. The destruction was devastating, shattering the nation's profound sense of security and generating an immediate response characterized by shock, overwhelming grief, and firm refusal to be intimidated. The trauma had rapid economic and infrastructural consequences. International air travel experienced a precipitous drop due as global travelers expressed concern about safety. Beyond safety, economic factors like a global recession played a role, and intensified security procedures related to visa applications led to the perception that the U.S. was becoming a less attractive destination, damaging its image abroad. At the operational level, the response at the Pentagon involving rapid coordination between federal, state, and local agencies offered painful but invaluable lessons for future large-scale domestic emergencies. In the immediate aftermath, President Bush declared that night fell on a different world, where freedom itself was under attack. The administration rapidly defined al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden, as representing a fringe form of Islamic extremism, whose goal was not merely crime, but remaking the world and imposing radical beliefs globally. This definition allowed the administration to articulate a comprehensive counterterrorism policy that leveraged the psychological shock. Drawing on the Cold War rhetorical template, the policy was infused with the concept of American exceptionalism, America's unique mission to spread its values and act as a force against evil. By October 2001, the global war on terror was formally established, defined as a global enterprise against all who seek to export terror and, crucially, against those governments that supported or sheltered them. This principle, announced in an address to Congress on September 20, 2001, immediately held states responsible for terrorists operating within their borders, laying the doctrinal foundation for the invasion of Afghanistan and later Iraq. The policy choice to transform a targeted counterterrorism operation into two full-scale military invasions required strategic framing. The 2001 invasion of Afghanistan was initiated after the Taliban regime refused to hand over Osama bin Laden and allow the destruction of al-Qaeda bases. This intervention was widely accepted as a direct response to the attacks. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, however, was far more contentious, causing deep discord across international alliances. Despite lacking specific evidence of operational links between Saddam Hussein's regime and the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration successfully framed the conflict as an extension of the War on Terror. This narrative linkage proved highly influential. More than 70% of Americans supported the war, even though many expected high casualties, economic detriment, and an increase in terrorist activities. The administration's definition of the war as part of a single global struggle provided the necessary domestic political cover, overriding diplomatic constraints and leading to military operations intended to remove Saddam Hussein from power. The lack of UN authorization signaled a departure from traditional post-Cold War multilateral norms, a policy choice facilitated by the overwhelming mandate granted by the 9/11 attacks. The single greatest measurable consequence of the War on Terror was the economic cost. The long-term costs of this global enterprise are staggering. By October 2019, the U.S. had spent approximately $6 trillion on efforts related to the Quad, a figure encompassing the costs of seemingly endless military campaigns, debt payments, and spending across various government departments. The attacks and the ensuing conflicts fundamentally reversed the economic trajectory of the post-Cold War era. The end of the Soviet Union had promised a peace dividend, the economic benefit derived from scaling back defense spending and redirecting resources to social programs or tax cuts. Research suggests that cuts in military spending can reap long-term economic benefits and greater growth. However, 9/11 caused U.S. military spending, which had fallen between 1985 and 1999, to increase strongly to fund the conflicts. This increased spending on security necessarily diverted labor and capital resources away from productive private sector activities and toward anti-terrorist activity, imposing significant transaction costs and inefficiencies on the economy. In a scenario where the 9/11 attacks did not occur, the Bush administration's pre-existing mandate to focus on great power competition and avoid nation building would have persisted, ensuring that the colossal resources and political energy spent in the Middle East were redirected to East Asia and domestic priorities. The attacks provided a period of strategic relaxation for the People's Republic of China, often referred to as a strategic penumbra, as Washington's strategic focus shifted thousands of miles away to the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan. Without 9/11, this distraction would be absent. U.S. strategists would have remained fully engaged in concerns about China's rising power and accelerating modernization. This sustained focus would have mandated earlier, perhaps more overt, measures to counter China's development of coercive military capabilities intended to expand its power in East Asia and pressure pro-independence forces on Taiwan. The absence of the global counterterrorism framework would have compelled the U.S. to define its global role largely through the lens of great power competition, potentially accelerating strategic friction and technological rivalry with Beijing, years earlier than occurred in the historical timeline. The U.S. approach would have prioritized maintaining regional stability against the strategic competitor, defining its grand strategy around managing China rather than fighting non-state actors. The pre-9/11 emphasis on managing tensions with China meant the Bush administration would likely have followed through on internal policy discussions aimed at stabilizing the Taiwan Strait. This involved utilizing diplomacy to seek mutual verifiable restraint agreements. Specifically, the U.S. could have encouraged Taipei to eschew additions to its anti-missile capability in exchange for Beijing stopping the increase in missile threats directed at Taiwan. The lack of a unifying existential threat like al-Qaeda would have restrained the administration's missionary zeal. The need to maintain focus on the core strategic competitor would have promoted cautious, high-stakes diplomacy over militarized confrontation. This approach contrasts sharply with the post-9/11 era, where the immediate threat of terrorism allowed the administration to largely sideline complex long-term diplomatic efforts in favor of swift military action. If negotiations failed, however, the sustained focus on China would have necessitated an earlier, substantial military response to Chinese expansion, likely in the form of accelerated U.S. engagement in regional military dynamics. The decision to invade Iraq in 2003 severely fractured transatlantic relations, particularly within NATO, where opinions were divided, and the organization as a whole had no role in the decision or conduct of the campaign. In the counterfactual, NATO would have maintained greater internal cohesion, avoiding the political crisis caused by the U.S.-led operation. Iraqi Freedom Alliance resources could have been focused on core European security missions or managing other global conflicts under a multilateral framework. Furthermore, without the immediate mandate for full-scale invasion, any necessary counterterrorism actions against al-Qaeda, which remained a definite, if contained, threat, would have been constrained to multilateral intelligence operations, sanctions, and limited military strikes aligned with the late Clinton-era approach. Any major international military engagement would have been far more likely to require authorization from the United Nations Security Council, preventing the unilateral actions that strained global institutions post-2001. This continued reliance on international institutions, such as the UN and NATO, would reinforce their standing and potentially lead to earlier, more structured cooperation on emerging global challenges, rather than the initial U.S. reluctance to involve established alliances after the historical 9/11. The structure of domestic security in the U.S. today is almost entirely a product of the reactive legislation and institutional consolidation following 9/11. In a world without the attacks, this transformation would have been averted, or at least greatly mitigated, maintaining a stronger historical continuum of civil liberties protection. The institutional response to 9/11 was sweeping and rapid. The Aviation and Transportation Security Act, signed in November 2001, established the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, federalizing airport security. In March 2003, the federal government created the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, consolidating 22 separate agencies to create a comprehensive security framework. In the counterfactual, such a massive and rapid reorganization is improbable. While security concerns existed, particularly in aviation, which was implicated in the attacks, improvements would likely have been incremental and technical, managed by existing agencies like the Federal Aviation Administration. The institutional complexity and high financial cost of centralizing 22 agencies into DHS would not have been politically justifiable absent the immediate trauma and mandate provided by 9/11, preserving a more decentralized administrative structure and lower bureaucracy costs. The USA Patriot Act, passed nearly unanimously in the post-9/11 climate, represented an overnight revision of surveillance laws that vastly expanded the government's authority to spy on its own citizens. This law authorized vital information sharing and allowed law enforcement and intelligence officials to use tools against terrorists previously restricted to use against criminals like drug dealers and mobsters. Without 9/11, the pre-existing problem of intelligence failure, the inability of agencies like the FBI and CIA to connect the dots, would still demand attention. However, the process of reform would be difficult and slow, requiring years of negotiation to establish clearer rules for information sharing while safeguarding civil liberties. The absence of the terrorist attack removes the political pressure needed to override the existing legal and international privacy safeguards, such as those embedded in FISA and the ICCPR. Consequently, civil liberties would have faced an evolutionary challenge from advancing technology and gradual governmental requests for power, rather than the revolutionary expansion of surveillance authority that the Patriot Act enabled. The economic consequences of avoiding the war on terror are enormous. The approximately $6 trillion spent on the conflicts would represent capital available for reallocation, offering the potential for a realized peace dividend. High levels of military spending retard long-run economic growth by absorbing resources that could be used for growth-enhancing investments. In the alternative scenario, this vast pool of capital could be directed toward large-scale domestic investment, such as infrastructure modernization or increased social spending, potentially fostering long-term economic growth. Furthermore, the economic friction caused by the intensified security screening, standardized visa procedures, and heightened concern about U.S. attractiveness as a destination would be absent. International commerce and travel would avoid the imposition of increased transaction costs and inefficiencies that resulted from the massive shift toward anti-terrorist activity. The cultural landscape of the United States experienced a profound polarization after 9/11, largely centered on the perception and treatment of Muslim and Arab Americans. While stereotyping and prejudice existed before the attacks, 9/11 provided the critical national trauma that transformed this prejudice into institutionalized suspicion. Prior to 2001, Arab and Muslim Americans were often described as a silent minority, subject to stereotyping and misunderstanding. The terrorist attacks instantly changed this status, transforming them into a problem ethnic group in the U.S. consensus. This moment was the tipping point that allowed Islamophobia to be adopted as a leading trope of national grievance. In the counterfactual, the process of assimilation and cultural integration would proceed along a far less toxic path. The immense spike in hate crimes that occurred in 2001, where nearly 5% of all religiously motivated hate crimes were directed against Muslims, would have been averted. Without the national crisis to fuel the fear-mongering and political rhetoric that cemented the stereotype that Muslims are terrorists, the community would have faced traditional immigrant challenges and prejudices, but without the immediate, overwhelming force of state-sanctioned suspicion and widespread societal backlash. The historical outcome saw pervasive media narratives and political rhetoric defining terrorism primarily as a non-white Muslim phenomenon, leading to the entrenchment of false narratives. This legalized targeting and stereotyping empowered acts of violence and discrimination against all people perceived to be Muslim or Arab. In the alternative timeline, while prejudice would naturally persist, the absence of the catastrophic shock means that the rapid, collective solidification of the Muslim terrorist trope would not occur. The media would have a slower, less polarized evolution in its representation, allowing journalists and community leaders to combat pre-existing discrimination organically, without having to fight a massive, government-sanctioned narrative that viewed the community as a source of internal radicalization risk. The historical reality included the implementation of massive surveillance programs specifically aimed at Muslim and Arab communities in the U.S. These programs led to visible losses of civil rights for these minorities. In a world without the emergency mandate of 9/11, the legal and political ground for such widespread, targeted surveillance would not exist. the protections afforded by domestic statutes would remain stronger, ensuring that the civil rights and economic stability of Arab and Muslim Americans are not eroded by institutionalized suspicion. The government would lack the necessary legal justification to initiate mass data collection and community policing policies based solely on religious or ethnic identity. The analysis demonstrates that 9/11 was not merely a trigger for the war on terror, but a catalyst that unlocked existing ideological predispositions, enabling a maximalist foreign and domestic policy response. The core tension in the counterfactual rests upon the massive opportunity cost imposed by the GWOT. The $6 trillion cost of the war on terror represents the single most significant factor diverting U.S. resources and attention over 2 decades. By avoiding the necessity of perpetual war, this capital could have facilitated a genuine domestic renewal, including infrastructure, education, or significant debt reduction, leading to potentially greater long-term economic growth. The U.S. geopolitical focus would have been fixed on managing the rising strategic competitor, China, requiring complex diplomacy and regional alignment rather than counterinsurgency in distant theaters. It is essential to acknowledge that the counterfactual world is not a perfect utopia. The threat of al-Qaeda remained real, even before 9/11. The failure of the intelligence community to adequately connect the dots due to insufficient information sharing was a known weakness. If the U.S. avoided the catastrophic shock of 9/11, it might have also avoided the subsequent, albeit flawed, intelligence reforms implemented through the Patriot Act and the creation of DHS. This creates a structural vulnerability. Without the crisis, the political inertia against fundamental intelligence restructuring remains high. This means that the existing terrorist groups, while contained through law enforcement and limited intelligence operations, might have remained capable of launching a successful, large-scale domestic attack at a later date, e.g., in 2005 or 2008. Such a delayed attack, occurring when the political climate was less unified than 2001, could have resulted in a reactive, less organized, and potentially more destructive policy response than the initial post-9/11 overreaction. Furthermore, the sustained strategic focus on China, while economically beneficial, carries the risk of earlier and heightened military tensions in East Asia, especially concerning negotiations over Taiwan's missile defenses. The central theme of a world without the war on terror is one of structural constraint and geopolitical focus. The U.S. government, bound by its initial pre-9/11 mandate of skepticism toward overextension and limited by existing legal and constitutional structures, would have been forced to be more judicious in its use of power. The absence of the unifying trauma of 9/11 would have preserved civil liberties, allowed for a massive domestic economic investment, and kept the nation's strategic attention focused on the Pacific. The world would have traded immediate, sweep-in action for slower, more constrained processes, accepting the continued but contained risk of terrorism in exchange for avoiding 2 decades of foreign wars and the corresponding erosion of the American domestic security structure. This has been History Rewritten. I'm your host, delving into the pivotal moments that shaped our world and the roads not taken. We want to know what history you want to explore next. Drop your topic suggestions in the comments.